is my hope that the family and community get the justice they so richly deserved, because this was disgusting.
New updates in the murder of 12-year-old Jocelyn Nungaray, the Texas girl whose body was found in a Houston bayou just last month. Investigators now say it was the suspect's roommate who tipped off police after seeing their photos on the news while in the same room with the accused killers.
They were able to identify the person in the images, and that is huge in terms of making sure that you're placing the defendant at the scene.
Plus, there's additional reports that at least one suspect was looking to flee the country.
The fact that they want to flee is highly relevant because, again, that's another sign of consciousness of guilt.
So could all this information be used at trial?
It is hearsay, but it would be admissible because it's an admission by the defendant.
And what about the looming possibility of the death penalty?
So the key for assessing whether or not a case is death penalty eligible is what we call HAC, heinous, atrocious, and cruel. So that is the standard.
The story of Jocelyn Nungaray takes us back to Sunday, June 16th in Houston, Texas. Right around midnight, Jocelyn snuck out of her home and went to a nearby 7-Eleven. Security cameras catch this on video, showing Jocelyn at the convenience store both alone and then later with two male suspects. Hours after this, in the early morning of June 17th, Jocelyn's body was found in a nearby bayou.
This is just such a heartbreaking, tragic case to even have to come across our screens.
That's former prosecutor Melba Pearson.
I know that not only is the family in shambles, I can only imagine the larger community that's really struggling with this loss of this child who was cut down in her prime before she could have her quinceañera or her sweet 16 or even get to graduate high school or get married or have. She had her whole life ahead of her.
Prosecutors say the men responsible for Jocelyn's murder are 21-year-old Johan Jose Rangel Martinez and 26-year-old Franklin Jose Peña Ramos. Both men have been charged with capital murder and are now being held on $10 million bond each. A question that's going through everyone's mind is, why did this have to happen? This is a 12-year-old girl doing normal 12-year-old girl things, and it ends up very disastrous. So investigators are likely looking for a motive. What do you think a motive could be, and how important is it to find one?
Motive is important from the standpoint of it explains what happened to the jury. Even though a motive may not be necessary in order to prove a case, so in other words, if it's a second-degree murder type situation where there wasn't necessarily premeditation and this murder just happened, legally, you may not have to prove that this is why the crime happened. But it's always nice to give that explanation to the jury because then it helps them to kind of get their mind around the facts and what happened, and it is more likely to result in a guilty verdict. So why this happened, we don't know. My initial gut instinct when I read the facts is that this was sexually motivated. And that they either, intended to assault her or did in fact assault her, which then, of course, resulted in her death because of the fact that she would be a witness and could likely identify both of them. So that may be the motive. But again, we have to look at the totality of the evidence. We're still in early days as to what's publicly available. So, we need to wait out what the full facts are, and then at that point, maybe a motive might rise to the surface.
While a complete motive may still be unclear, there are some things we do know with the help of security camera video. Investigators say this same video that captured Jocelyn in the last few hours of her life also led police to her alleged killers.
We were able to find video and trace the movements of our suspects and of Jocelyn, and all the way to the point of where she was murdered and left in a bayou in the water.
The suspects first caught up with Jocelyn near the 7-Eleven, and this is caught on camera.
Suspects seen meeting the victim and talking for a few minutes while they were on Kirkendall. Later, the suspects and the victim walked together to a convenience store.
Shortly after the trio is seen on camera at 7-Eleven, they're seen leaving, heading toward a nearby bridge.
After a few minutes, all three together walked to a bridge where ultimately Jocelyn was murdered.
According to court documents, the suspects violated Jocelyn near this bridge for hours before killing her. They later threw her body in the nearby bayou. When Jocelyn's body was recovered, she wasn't wearing any pants. The next time the suspects were caught on camera is without Jocelyn.
Suspects continue south towards their residence after leaving Jocelyn there.
I want to thank Morgan & Morgan for sponsoring today's Law and Crime YouTube takeover. If you've seen our videos, you know Morgan & Morgan is a proud sponsor of Law and Crime, and that our content proves the world isn't always safe. So when you're hurt and don't know where to turn, look no further than Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm. With Morgan & Morgan, there's a $0 upfront fee. You only pay them if you win. If you've ever been injured, you can start your Morgan & Morgan claim in 8 clicks or less at forthepeople.com/YouTube takeover. But there's an important part of the story that comes before the suspects ever met Jocelyn.
We have found and learned that the suspects began their evening at a Northborough area restaurant together.
Officials say security camera video showed both Rangel Martinez and Peña Ramos at the restaurant before seeing Jocelyn at 7-Eleven. But they weren't the only people there. A third person, the suspect's roommate, later told police he was with both men at the restaurant before splitting up from them at about 10 o'clock. This roommate proves vital in tracking down both suspects because he's the one who reported them to police.
Eyewitness testimony is always critical.
This roommate, whose name has not been released publicly, says he only moved in with Rangel Martinez and Peña Ramos on June 17th. That's the day Jocelyn's body was found. He'd been kicked out of his apartment and was crashing with the suspects even though he didn't know them very well. It was the next day, on Tuesday, June 18th, when the man realized his new roommates could be involved in the murder. The roommate told investigators he was watching TV with both Rangel Martinez and Peña Ramos when a news report about Jocelyn's death came up. The report showed the surveillance video of both suspects, and the roommate recognized them immediately. He told investigators he tried not to react and then made an excuse to leave. That's when he called police. How vital is that roommate's testimony to investigators?
While this roommate is not exactly an eyewitness to the crime, they were able to identify the person in the images, and that is huge in terms of making sure that you're placing the defendant at the scene, that someone is able to say, okay, I recognize this person. And again, that all goes to the identification process, which is critical in establishing that this is the person that committed the crime.
Pearson says this testimony is invaluable to the case, as is the security camera video, and there could be more of it. In this case, one of the ways that investigators tracked down the suspects was surveillance video, because we have images of Jocelyn on screen near 7-Eleven with 2 of these suspects who have since been arrested. So to me, that shows that surveillance video, security cam footage is really vital in this case. Do you think as this moves forward through the judicial system, we could see additional images that we haven't seen yet?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that is going to have to be measured, of course, because you don't want to release all of the photos in the media. You want to be able to preserve that for trial. You don't want to taint your potential jury pool with them seeing all the evidence, and then you're trying to reintroduce it in trial, and people may have already formed a verdict basically in their head before hearing on and seeing all of the evidence. So I think we may see 1 or 2 more images, but I don't think it would be a treasure trove of images until later on. The other important aspect is going to be DNA evidence. Now, knowing that she was thrown into the water, which again was just shameful and disgusting, there is a question as to whether or not DNA could be recovered from her body. If it is, it's going to be very critical evidence. But again, depending on how long she was in the water, how far she was submerged. And again, this is very disturbing. And I know this can be a lot for people, but just from the evidentiary perspective, that preservation of evidence is very important. So We just have to see if hopefully DNA can play a role in being able to bring this case to a conclusion.
Test results have shown Jocelyn was sexually assaulted and semen was found on her body, but so far, a match for that DNA has not yet been reported. While investigators are working to analyze that DNA evidence, there's also cell phone data to review, and prosecutors say they've already found some interesting information.
We have gotten into Martinez Rangel's phone and found evidence that he was searching for ways to leave the country once his image was released to the media.
This evidence is corroborated by information from a second witness, the suspect's boss. We've also seen some reports that one of the defendants went to his boss and asked for money because he had planned to flee the country. And we heard this from prosecutors too, that going through cell phone data, they saw some Google searches kind of looking like these defendants, at least one, maybe both, were looking to flee the country. Is that relevant?
The fact that they want to flee is highly relevant because, again, that's another sign of consciousness of guilt. Why are you trying to flee right after this incident? What is the factor that made you decide that you wanted to leave, especially since you took such pains to be able to come to this country in the first place? So again, that is going to be very critical testimony between the Google searches, the statements of the boss, as well as the demeanor of the defendant when speaking to his boss. I mean, was he frantic? Was he sweating? What words was he using? Those are all things that can be brought into court and then illustrates for the jury the state of mind that the defendant was in. And again, help paint a more broader picture of the events that occurred on that day.
The boss also told police one of the suspects told him they made a mistake on Sunday night and hurt someone, and the person was dead. Now, is this hearsay? Would he be allowed to testify to this? What would all of that look like?
So it is hearsay, but it would be admissible because it's an admission by the defendant. So by admitting that he was out, may have done something, looking at the time frame of when he made that statement, was it directly after the homicide happened? Was it a day later? Was it a month later? Those are the types of things that the prosecutor is going to have to consider in order to determine whether or not this testimony is going to be helpful. On the surface, from what I'm hearing and seeing, this is going to be very critical testimony because, again, it shows state of mind, it shows consciousness of guilt, and it can be viewed as an admission. Now, granted, the defense could argue that, well, he did something bad after partying. He could have crashed his car or he could have stolen something. I mean, it could be something innocuous, and that could be an argument that the defense could make. But again, looking at the time frame of when that admission happened, that would be the way for the prosecution to be able to overcome that argument.
For now, both suspects are being held in Harris County on some pretty serious charges. So both suspects in this case were charged with capital murder because this is an adolescent, a 12-year-old victim. And prosecutors originally said we may consider the death penalty if we find out the victim was sexually assaulted, which it turns out, unfortunately, she was sexually assaulted. What do you think is going through the prosecutor's mind, as yourself a former prosecutor, to determine whether they should seek death penalty?
So the key for assessing whether or not a case is death penalty eligible is what we call HAC, heinous, atrocious, and cruel. So that is the standard in terms of, was this crime really disturbing? Was this crime, and all crimes obviously can be disturbing, especially when you look at the fact that it's a homicide, but is this especially heinous? Again, you're looking at the age and sensitivity of the victim. So you have a child victim, or if you have an elderly victim, or if this was a situation where maybe it was a mass shooting or a hate-related crime. Those are the types of crimes that you often see fall under the umbrella of heinous, atrocious, and cruel. Especially serial killers, that commonly falls under the category of heinous, atrocious, and cruel. And then also, too, you have to think about the particular dynamics in your jurisdiction. For instance, I reside in Florida, and for us, when I was actively trying cases, of, a second degree murder would mean that we'd have 6 jurors. When you look at a first degree murder and a death penalty case, you're looking at 12 jurors. So it's often easier to convince 6 rather than 12. So you have to make that calculus as well. Looking at the length of the trial as well, because again, you have to think about the fact that you're bringing in a number of witnesses. You have the initial phase, which is whether or not the defendant is guilty. And then once that has been determined, then there's the penalty phase, which is a whole other hearing on top of that. So that extends the length of the trial. And that too can be an issue when you think about availability of witnesses and things like that. But I think the most important aspect to think about is the desire of the family. Many times there's instances where families don't want the death penalty. They rather the defendant live the rest of their life in prison, because then that way they have to think about what they did each and every single day. Others may have religious reasons why they don't want to see the death penalty happen. And then there's other families who are like, we want the death penalty, end of story, and we will go through the entire process, as painful as it may be, because we view that to be justice. So prosecutors do have to weigh the thoughts and concerns of the next of kin, because they're the ones who are closest to the pain.
Jocelyn's family has spoken out to local TV stations saying they oppose the death penalty, but it's still unclear what route prosecutors will take. But there's another contentious aspect of the case that's also making headlines. This case has also become politically charged in that both defendants are undocumented migrants originally from Venezuela, and they had previously been arrested in the weeks leading up to Jocelyn's murder. How is all of that relevant, Melba?
So, as far as I'm concerned, the undocumented status has nothing to do with this crime. The reality is, these are two people that are accused of doing something incredibly heinous, and they're going to go through the justice system the same way any other defendant would. I will say, though, as someone who was a prosecutor for 16 years, handling homicides and all manner of violent cases, the vast majority of the defendants you see every single day in the courthouses in America are U.S. citizens, usually born and raised. The undocumented people that you may see in the system are few and far between. Often we see a handful of cases that get highly publicized and turned into the face of the issue around immigration, which that's not to say that immigration is not a hot button issue that should be handled. However, I don't think that should necessarily, these cases should be the driving force behind it, because there is no crime wave being executed by undocumented migrants. The vast majority of immigrants, both documented and undocumented, that come to this country don't want to get caught. They want to keep their head down. They want to go to work, make money, support their families, maybe send some money back home. But they do not want to do anything to draw attention to themselves, especially if you're undocumented, because you're afraid of being deported and losing the opportunity that you were able to get by working here. Many people, I mean, you think about Venezuela and the political turmoil that they had over the last, decade or so. People flee and come here for a variety of reasons. So again, people who know that their home country is unstable and violent and problematic are not looking to raise their profile here so that they can be deported and sent back to the place where they may face death or harm to their loved ones or something along those lines. So I just want to caution people in terms of that the reality on the ground, if you ask any prosecutor that tries cases, they will tell you the vast majority are people that are American citizens. And there have been some other studies that corroborate that, not just the anecdotal testimony from prosecutors, but also just in terms of literal numbers and looking at stats across the country. That's not a real thing.
Only several weeks removed from Jocelyn's murder, the case still has a long road ahead. We're still early on in the investigation, just a couple weeks out from Jocelyn's murder, but where do you anticipate the case moving from here?
I see that this case is probably going to move fairly quickly from the standpoint of once the evidence has all been gathered and the discovery process has been completed, meaning that the prosecution turns all the relevant evidence over to the defense, then listen, if I was the defense attorney, I'd be looking for a plea. That's just the reality. Based on the evidence that's publicly available right now, this would be one of those situations where the defense will want to try and negotiate with the prosecution for a life sentence to spare their client's life. The prosecution may or may not agree, and again, that may all fall to what the next of kin may want and what they view as justice. So that becomes the question as to how this case may be resolved. It may end up going to trial. If it does, I could see it going to trial sometime within the next 2 years. But again, because of the fact that it's a death penalty case, those trials do take longer. And so that may be part of the issue in terms of when the actual trial will happen, because it does take a bit longer in order to prepare a death penalty case because of the fact that it's not just the trial itself, it's also the penalty phase and bringing in mitigating circumstances, if any, aggravating circumstances, which there are plenty, and all of the different aspects that need to be worked on in order to be able to complete a death penalty trial.
Both suspects are being held on $10 million bond each, plus an immigration hold. That means even if they do post bond, they still will not be released from the Harris County Jail. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.